Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third lecture of the Global Humanities Initiative with our distinguished guest, Cristina Rivera Garza. My name is Lisbeth Francois, and I am a college lecturer in Spanish working at Mary Edwards College, specializing in Mexican literature. It is a great honor and an immense pleasure to introduce Cristina for tonight's session, in which she will talk to us about translation and grieving, bilingualism and grieving. As many of you will know, both these notions are fundamental for understanding her practice as an author, intellectual, and professor of creative writing. As a Mexican writer working in the United States, thoroughly marked by the intergenerational experience of dwelling in the borderlands and living, writing, and teaching in two different languages, Cristina has consistently contested the fiction of a homogeneous and monolingual community. As the director of the first Ph.D. program in creative writing in Spanish at the University of Houston since 2017, the starting year of Donald Trump's first presidency, she has staunchly defended writing in Spanish and in other languages as a political act against enduring erasure of linguistic and cultural difference, an erasure that has now become more far-reaching than ever, unfortunately. As a sister of Liliana, the victim of a brutal femicide at a time when that very concept wasn't available yet, she has created a space to name and share pain in dialogue with the grieving of so many others who lost their loved ones to femicidal or drug-related violence. Bilingualism and grieving, however, are not just two separate strands that run through Cristina's work. They intersect in her long-standing commitment to a form of writing destined to honor the presence of others, especially those others who are not with us anymore. The language we speak is indeed never just our own. It has been molded by the voices of those who preceded us and of those with whom we share part of our time on Earth. In her book, Grieving, Cristina reminds us of the etymology of the word that inspired its Spanish title, condolerse, which translates roughly as to condole, like in the noun condolence. And it is here referring to condoling either oneself or one another, or indeed, as is the case here, both. From the Latin con, with, and dolere, to hurt, to condole is a way of experiencing hurt in dialogue with others. Dolerse con dolerse. Grieving, Cristina suggests, is rooted in acknowledgement that others form part of us, those others who have passed away, but also the others whose pain we are sharing. This acknowledgement, in turn, depends on a writing strategy that is predicated on the recognition of those multiple voices that shape our own. In her critical work, The Restless Dead, she has advocated accordingly for what she calls disappropriation, a mode of writing that rejects capitalist notions of intellectual property and authorship, signaling its communal and collaborative nature instead. Disappropriation means emphatically not appropriating the words of others in order to make them say something quote-unquote new, but foregrounding the traces of others as precisely that, as others, at the heart of anything we say. And as she later elaborated in her book, Geological Writings, these interactions are not just present in the realm of imaginations, in the realm of imagination as exchanges of ideas, but in the traces of material interactions that we find in texts themselves in the form of what she there called textual sediments. The previous two lectures, as many of you will recall, have explored these textual sediments in Cristina's own texts as the traces of the embodied writing experience left in her sister Liliana's documents, and in the letters written mid-20th century by Modesta Burgos from the mental asylum to which she was confined, and which shaped Cristina's first novel, No One Will See Me Cry. Touching these texts, retracing the handwriting and copying the handwriting of these texts, emerged there as a way of inhabiting the worlds of those who are no longer with us. In today's lecture, this inhabitation occurs at the intersection of different languages and the possibility they offer of refracting ourselves further as light through a prism in order to welcome the voices of others. Before we listen to Cristina, I would just like to make this a little more tangible through its striking thought from The Restless Dead, which I think encapsulates the way in which Cristina has marked the possibilities of bilingualism precisely in order to make us more receptive to what is supposedly foreign to us. Commenting on the challenges and struggles of teaching creative writing in English, which is not her mother tongue, long before she became the director of the Spanish language program in Houston, Cristina muses, "Not everyone has the opportunity, the privilege, with a question mark, to not know herself so radically in the middle of her life. That's what I tell myself to compensate. The passage resonated with me powerfully, not in the least because of my own daily struggle of living and teaching in two languages that are not my mother tongue. Speaking learned languages, so to speak, indeed, comes at a cost, but it also gives us the opportunity to experience life in plurality, to become other in the abandonment of linguistic stability. In that sense, it is at the heart of what so many students and colleagues here present aspire to do by embracing other languages and intercultural dialogue more broadly. Learning to not know ourselves, to open ourselves up to what lies beyond our usual frames of reference. I have witnessed in several classes and seminars how Cristina's texts have inspired students, colleagues, and her readers alike to do precisely that. And I am delighted that she is with us again tonight to emphasize the urgency of this work, of the importance of carving out spaces for those who are not with us anymore, as well as for those who still are. Thank you very much, Cristina.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. That was lovely. And ¿cómo están? Buenas tardes. ¿Todos bien? De regreso. Good. I'm very glad to see all of you in here. I have a couple of comments and one announcement today before I start the lecture, our third lecture. The first one is that some of you may know that what I'm sharing with you today and in these two previous occasions are portions, selections of longer, larger works. Things that I've been thinking about for some time now. When I first started to write these essays, I had the idea that they might become eventually a book. And now I've been receiving so many comments, very important questions, fruitful questions. I've been getting feedback, sources, links to this and the next. And it's been so really wonderful. I really think that now this series of lectures, the original versions of them in any case, will become a book. I'm pretty sure of that now. So I profusely thank you for that, for working with me on these issues too. All right, that was the first one. The second one, oh no, and I have to say something that I really believe, that this is the university, what university does at its best, right? To keep the conversation alive, especially the most complicated, the hardest conversations. This is what we do the best. This is why we're called the Humanities. I truly believe that, so thank you again. Now, the announcement, and this is as preparation for our last, sadly, lecture next week. I had planned to conclude my interventions at Cambridge with an essay on the common graves of the poor, what it is like, what it means to be a descendant of people who died and were buried in this way. This is a topic that figures prominently in Autobiography of Cotton, the English version of which just dropped on May the 5th, by the way, just in case you're interested in acquiring this book. But I've been, feeling the audience, and I've been following really closely the way in which we've been engaged in the last two sessions. And I've been talking to Carlos about it, and I think I have an alternative plan for our next session. It is going to be a lecture that may turn into a performance that might require of your participation too. But don't be afraid. I'm not going to be spotlighting you or anything like that. You will participate if you feel like it, if it comes organically to you. But I think it is important. We've been talking about the materiality of writing. We've been talking about collaborative writing. We've been talking about how communities get created also through writing. And I think it is important that we get a taste of that, all of us together. I'm not going to say anything else, but I'm going to ask you a favor. I would love if you could collect twigs as you stroll around Cambridge, just little ramitas, something not too big, 10, 15, 20 centimeters long, sturdy, something that feels like a pencil, a pen in your hand. It doesn't have to have a pointy end, just almost like a writing instrument. You may be using that at the end of the session next week. So if you remember, doing this, that would be wonderful. I'll try to bring my own too, so we'll be prepared. But I think it's always better when we all pitch in and participate, and from the very beginning. So that would be fantastic if you participate with that. And my last sentence here was, I'm not going to disclose the specific use we'll give to these instruments, but trust me, much in life is, after all, about trust. All right? So now, about today's lecture. I will start, as I've done in my previous interventions, with the personal, and which is not necessarily the individual. These are different concepts, right? So the personal, which we all know is political, how bilingualism, specifically English, allowed me to come close to painful events I lived in Spanish many years ago. Obviously, this is going to be in reference to Liliana's Invincible Summer, mostly. The only work that I have written originally, both in English and in Spanish. I will then move to the world of Spanish, English, bilingual, contemporary writers working from within the United States. I have, this is based on a research that I have conducted for the last 2-3 years. Interviews with Latinx, Latine writers who grew up in bilingual homes, and that even though they publish mostly or entirely in English, maintain a strong, fruitful relationship with Spanish. This research also includes, explorations, slow reading, and interviews with Spanish-speaking writers that have built their physical and literary home in the USA. I'm not going to have time to talk about the ones who write in Spanish from the United States, but do know that they are part of this ongoing research. This move is clearly relates to a situated conversation, one that I'm entirely part of, but clearly transcends my personal experience and points, I hope, to the complex reality of a Latin American literature that is not confined either by existing geopolitical boundaries or language. United States is the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. Home to writers who live within a tense scaffolding of multiple languages glued together by ferocious hierarchies of class, ethnicity, and gender. So while under attack, I believe that the ongoing Latin Americanization of the United States is real, and it comes with a tide of very specific literary works as well. We must find a name for that, for this production that is increasingly important and increasingly visible too in the Spanish-speaking world as such. So I am fully aware, obviously, that I am in front of a multilingual audience right now. And please do know that from the start, that in what follows, I'm not making an argument about mastering, as in mastering a language. I'm working in a different direction. I'm working towards an understanding of vulnerability in language as a place of creativity and resistance. And vulnerability and mastering are not necessarily the same, as we well know. So I'll be suggesting that, in fact, the language in which we render ourselves most vulnerable, and very often this is our second or third or fourth or the other language, however you want to call it. And this vulnerable language could be, in fact, our literary language. So that's what I'm trying to navigate. This is what I'm trying to get at. Let's see if I am successful at it. All right? Here we go. Translation mode on. Oh, and I'm always changing the titles of my conferences. I'm sorry. They're alive. They're mutating continuously. I would wake up early in the morning in an empty room. And when I say empty, I mean there was, in that spacious room, only a single bed, a nightstand, a lamp, all surrounded by an enormous window where the morning light came in, soon covered by mist. Wow, this sounds like my apartment here in Cambridge. But well, okay. Still lingering between wakefulness and sleep, I would sit at the only table, on the only chair, and without tending to the needs of cleanliness or nourishment, I would begin writing. In that house, surrounded by wide pane windows, where I was accompanied by no one, not even the choreography of furniture, not one of the final versions of Liliana's Invincible Summer took shape, the English version. I had begun writing the book in a different place, battered by the heat and the increasing humidity of a very long summer, swamped by papers close to the everyday plates and cups and the aroma of the spices carefully stored in the pantry. The window of the studio looked out to the 3 stern tree trunks that watched my movements from the front yard, perhaps urging me to go on, perhaps grieving with me. The streets of that neighborhood, suddenly deserted, revealed the peculiar wanderers of the pandemic, groups of hens, stray cats, tiny toads drawn by the downpours, haughty herons. What is the birth of a book? When the first word is placed in a word file, knowing little about what will come next, or when the word end is typed, right when one surrenders and has nothing else to give? I don't know. At some point in 2020, the first words flashed up on the screen, and soon there was no escape. Often, those words belonged to Spanish, the language in which I was raised, but on other days, perhaps the most difficult ones, I wrote originally in English, almost in secret, as if hiding from myself. Having been born on the Mexican side of the US-Mexico border, I became used to English from an early age, its rhythms and its menace, its intonation, its expediency. But it was not until my 20s that English came into my life for good, opening a basement, so to speak, into the house of my perception system. Because it grew organically, I did not develop a method in a strict sense, but the operation went more or less as follows. I'd write a sentence or a paragraph, or several of them, in Spanish, and I let them linger on the screen. At some point, as I reread, I would interrupt the natural flow of the narration to insert a sentence or a paragraph, or several of them, trying to convey in English what had been written originally in Spanish. The same worked the other way around. Soon, I found myself with a convoluted file brimming with interconnected paragraphs that were, and were not, mirrors of one another. As it has been my habit in other projects, I began each workday by reviewing what I had written the day before, whether 5 pages or 225. This time, the process took an unusual turn. Instead of employing the same language to correct verb conjugations or adjust syntax, I started using the other language to do so. If I had written in Spanish, I revised in English. If I had written in English, I revised in Spanish. Some might call this translation. Some might call it rewriting. Maybe it was something else entirely. Although slow and exhausting and confusing at times, I must admit, this method allowed me to move forward with a book that, due to the personal grief it carried, often felt overwhelming. In the end, I generated a file in which English interrupted Spanish, or Spanish provided continuity to a phrase or a paragraph in English, causing a disorder that only later and with great care and even more work I had to unravel. This is how the bifurcation occurred. Liliana's Invincible Summer, which was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in autobiography or memoir category in 2024, is not the first book I've written in translation mode. It is, however, the first one I have published in its original versions in both Spanish and English as separate, yet interdependent entities. I have lived over 30 years in the United States, perhaps a bit more now, where I had worked and loved bilingually between Spanish and English. Over time, I've written creative pieces directly in English, but I have seldom been interested in sharing or publishing them. Between 1997 and 2002, when I was a professor in the history department of San Diego State University, I published academic articles directly in English that contributed to my tenure. Fortunately, publications on the history and daily life of the General Insane Asylum La Castañeda, which incidentally are little known in Spanish these days. From 2008 to 2016, I was a professor, and at times I headed the MFA in Creative Writing, an English language writing program at the University of California, San Diego, which was established in 2001. And since 2017, I have run a Ph.D. program in creative writing in Spanish at the University of Houston. While all of this was happening, I wrote from within the United States and directly in Spanish books as diverse as La Cresta de León, Ilia Crest, and Dolerse, Grieving, that is being referred to right here, Textos desde un país herido, which I published with Spanish language publishers. It has been many years of moving between languages, working intensely and consciously with and between and through Spanish and English. From this constant interaction, a translation mode has gradually but inevitably emerged. One that activates immediately whenever I set to write anything. Above all, it is a state of heightened awareness. One does not write in one language while excluding the other. One writes in a language from or with the other. Like ghosts, one language hounds the other, never leaving it in peace. Like co-joined twins, one language is physically attached to the other, breathing in unison. Like a graft, a bud from one language is placed into another to yield new fruits and unfamiliar plants. But despite their inevitable, almost organic closeness, these languages remain distinct, each offering its mysteries and peculiarities, its grammatical rules, its unique rhythms, its historical idiosyncrasies. And because of these, they can critically engage with and challenge each other. I once asked the Italian activist and philosopher Branko Berardi Bifo, I don't know if you've read him here. Yes, good. Why he had written his later books directly in English, which he's done, by the way. And his response, immediate and striking in its apparent simplicity, stayed with me. Because in Italian, he said, I'm just too wordy. Or at least that's how I remember it. En español creo que dijo, es que en italiano echo mucho rollo. That's what it is. Referring to its own verbosity. Writing in English forces me to be concise, no, this is not, and get straight to the point. That's what he said. In my case, English gave me courage. Let me correct this. English sheltered me during those bleak days of the scorching summer and later during the days of empty rooms by the coast, when I lived in an apartment stripped of furniture and full of light. Unlike Spanish, the language in which I lived through the painful events I explored in Liliana's Invincible summer, English granted me a protective distance, allowing me to navigate the darkest parts without collapsing. English stood also there on those leaden days when the afternoon storm clouds drained my spirit and urged me to give up. Can so-called second languages do something that native languages cannot? In Home, the novel that Hungarian writer Andrea Tompa published as Hasa in 2020, translated into English by Josefina Comporali in 2024, she explores the disorientation and familiarity that accompany every return home. In the early moments of the narrative, as our protagonist discusses the limits of mother tongues, or so-called mother tongues, in the telling of this story, she poses a piercing question. If the circus magic of the mother tongue only serves to hide the corpses and the unspeakable, in what language can one articulate the truth? The truth, in my case, was a grief forcibly silenced by a patriarchal narrative that refused accountability in crimes of domestic violence, or, as they are now more accurately called, acts of intimate partner terrorism perpetrated year after year. On July 16, 1990, when my sister was murdered by Ángel González Ramos, her ex-boyfriend, the only way to narrate this act of male violence was through the lens of a crime of passion, a story that implicitly blames the victims and exonerates the perpetrators. Like so many families in similar circumstances, we found ourselves at a dead end. We could not speak of Liliana's femicide because doing so would incriminate her and us, hurting her and hurting ourselves in the meantime. But we also could not speak of Liliana because the silence would eat us alive, tearing us apart from within. Faced with the absence of language to fully articulate this gender violence from the perspective of women and their loved ones, we did what so many others have done in the past. We turned inward, retreating into a dungeon thick with guilt and shame, one from which we could not escape. And so it went on for many, many years. Sometime later, and in a different country, exploring the story was no less devastating. But by then, I had at my disposal the language that a vigorous feminist movement had forged over the past 2 or 3 decades. A language capable of identifying the countless acts of violence that, through their sheer frequency, had embedded themselves into everyday life, acquiring an air of normalcy. This language, which gifted us with words to unveil the crime, enabled us to recount stories of violence from the perspective of women, and in doing so, protect ourselves and protect others. I already knew that, as the Chilean collective, the Thesis, and their followers so powerfully express, it wasn't her fault, not where she was, nor how she was dressed. No era su culpa, ni dónde estaba, ni cómo vestía. But knowing something intellectually is one thing, convincing the body of it is another entirely. Often, I had to stop writing just to catch my breath. Other times, I simply gave up. Staring in apparent calm at the colorful notes I had stuck on the walls, right above the piles of papers I consulted when the writing was good. Dates, names, places. Every afternoon, after eating with my family, I would take a long walk through the deserted streets of the pandemic, guided by the curiosity of Lara, the little brown dog, for whom grass, rocks, and sidewalks, and the tree trunks, obviously, remain a daily novelty. Sometimes I returned feeling hopeful. Sometimes I came back empty-handed. Frequently, I dreamt of Liliana, waking up in the middle of the night, screaming, the crushing weight of a stone on my chest, convinced that I could still save her. More often, I had to admit that nothing could be undone. I suppose it was on one of those difficult mornings that English showed up, uninvited. I didn't decide to write this book in English. During those bleakest summer days, I don't remember waking up one morning with a conscious plan or an explicit intention to change course. I did it without thinking, as if someone else or something else inside me had taken the reins of language. What I did deliberately conceive was the willingness to open myself to the possibility. Once the process began, I chose to accept that on some days, depending on causes still obscure, perhaps incomprehensible, I would write in English, and others, just as inexplicably, I would write in Spanish. I did not opt for Spanglish because that practice, as a historically determined cultural phenomenon, doesn't belong to just anyone. Spanglish, which has generated a powerful literary movement in the United States since at least the mid-20th century, is deeply tied to the conditions of exploitation in which entire generations of Spanish speakers grew up in the United States. I arrived in the United States at 24 to pursue graduate studies. Too late for Spanglish, at least in my case. As I usually say, I got to the United States when the damage was all done. So, even without mixing languages, what I set out to do from the beginning was to weave revision patterns, using Spanish to question English and vice versa. Whether translation or rewriting, I took to heart these creative practices and ran with them. The connection between both languages might not be evident through the hybridization of words featured on the text, but it could shape the writing from its very foundation, perhaps invisible, yet deeply noticeable in the conscious structuring of each writing decision, from sentence construction to syntax, grammar, and diction. It took me quite some time to fully understand that this was a method, and that this method which I initially understood as a literary tactic, was also, perhaps above all, a survival strategy. It took me even longer to realize that this method, which seemed new to me, had already been embedded in every book I had written since moving to the United States. All of them, as I said earlier, written in Spanish, but written, in fact, in translation mode. Sometimes you realize you are writing in translation mode until much later. In 2023, with the support of the Maria Zambrano Fellowship from the University of Barcelona, I began a research project exploring the relationship that a group of bilingual US-based Latinx writers maintain with Spanish, even as they publish almost exclusively in English. Raquel Gutierrez and Vanessa Angelica Villarreal among them, but we've already interviewed and included many more writers belonging to these emerging newer generations. Daniel Bursovsky is one of them, a wonderful translator. Javier Zamora, who published Solito, a memoir not too long ago. I would include him definitely in this group. Daniel Alarcón, writing in English from Peru. Perhaps Emilio Pasoldan from the United States, writing in Spanish. So I'm considering, I'm casting a wide net, and I'm trying to really pay attention to the fact that they are writing in the context of this current bilingualism, a very tense situation right now in the United States. So lacking a universal term, I referred to them, as they requested, escritoras latinas, emphasizing the E to question gender binarism while keeping the A in all other grammatical interactions. I reached out to Raquel Gutierrez, the poet and essayist who grew up in a Latino neighborhood in Los Angeles and was living in Arizona, completing an MFA in creative writing there. We shared an ongoing conversation that had unfolded across joint appearances on panels at the annual AWP Association of Writers and Writing Programs, conferences, and most memorably, a road trip to the Otay area, right on the border between Tijuana and San Diego, where we gazed at the 8 prototypes for border walls funded by Donald Trump's first administration through the holes in a heavily rusted metal wall. At the time, Raquel was writing, or nearly finishing, Brown Neon, a collection of personal essays that blends travel writing with queer genealogy. The book won the Judy Grant Award for Lesbian Nonfiction in 2023 and was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award in the Lesbian Biography Memoir category that year. Though our public presentations took place in English, the Spanish dominated nearly all our private conversations. A twisted version of the relationships between English and Spanish assumes, with haunting frequency, that if a Latina writer publishes in English, it is because she has lost, or worse, rejected Spanish. This belief, which upholds guilt or worse, betrayal, blatantly ignores what Mije linguist Yasnaya Aguilar, one of our foremost scholars, critical, wonderful mind, has convincingly argued regarding indigenous languages. No one loses their native language at will. Languages don't die out naturally. They are systematically killed by the policies of monolingual states, threatened by the demographic and linguistic diversity of our contemporary world, specifically migration, of course. Only in conditions of great inequality can it be advisable or even beneficial to leave a language behind or to pretend that it has been left behind, reducing its use to domestic or private places. The narrative of Spanish as a lost language confirms the social and linguistic hierarchy that assigns primacy to English in a country where the demographic and cultural presence of migrants from the Spanish-speaking world is significant and continues to grow. According to some sources, there are between 50 and 60 million Spanish speakers living in the United States, making it, as I said earlier, the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. Of all of them, about 10 or 11 million of us identify as bilinguals. Even then, or precisely because of these, Spanish is still considered a language of labor, with all class and racial implications of the case, a language inadequate for reflection or creativity. In times of heightened white nationalism, in which the English-only movement has just scored a victory with the executive order that declared English as the official language of the United States for the first time in history, reflecting on the lives and practices of speakers and writers who move between English and Spanish is more necessary than ever. The daughter of a Mexican father and a Salvadorian mother, Raquel Gutierrez grew up in a Spanish-dominated home near Echo Park, east of Los Angeles. English arrived early, however, and soon dominated communication at home. Her parents learned and adapted English as their work offered them a degree of social mobility, and Raquel began attending public schools where her good grades guaranteed her enrollment in advanced placement programs, APP, which were not offered in Spanish, of course. Between one thing and another, Raquel became interested in music, especially playing the drums, and read, in English translation, a good number of fierce Central American poets, such as Roque Dalton and Claribel Alegría, as well as the classics, such as César Vallejo and Pablo Neruda. These foundational readings taught her that poetry went hand in hand with politics. Indeed, that poetry could not exist without politics. On her long journey to the university, she participated with growing curiosity in an energetic world of activists, writers, anarchists, musicians, and members of the LGBTQ community in South LA. It was then that she began to write poems in Spanish, but increasingly so, and more over time, in English, especially because, also over time, she came to be interested in publishing. She preserved in her ear the rhythm of the stories her mother ingratiated her with when she was a child, and that sound of Spanish laid the basis for the crafting of her poetry and essays. Spanish was not lost. It permeated the walls of English, existing in its auric materiality. English did not overwhelm everything. It opened itself to the dispositions of Spanish, acquiring new grammatical forms. The process could go unnoticed if one didn't pay enough attention, but not for bilinguals who, like her, navigated between the waves of two distinct languages. When Raquel explored her sought-after position outside the North American literary mainstream, she coined the Spanish word afueramiento, meaning, oh my gosh, I've been skipping all this, sorry. Afueramiento, meaning outsideness. She did not simply refer to a marginalized place imposed on her by a system of strong hierarchies based on race, gender, and class, but instead, she spoke of a personal quest to deliberately carve out a space for herself outside the commercialization of literature and art. An outsider can be an outlaw, a fugitive, or even a criminal. But it can also be someone who, from a strategic position outside or against the status quo, poses critical questions about the entire environment. In this outsideness, Poetry and politics are closely intertwined, generating works that challenge North American society, not only through the materials chosen or the themes they address, but also through the forms that repeatedly challenge the established boundaries between literary genres and languages. In this afueramiento, Raquel insists on paying attention to the rhythms of Spanish, which she continues to listen to and produce in her work. In this outsiderness, Raquel works at the junction of two languages to deploy herself in all her complexity. Sometimes you must produce that strategic afueramiento to undertake the arduous path of mourning. Horror robs us of language, but pain gives it back to us. Acts of horrific violence force us to consider the unthinkable, especially the inconceivable, leaving us irremediably speechless. Bringing together the scraps left behind by devastation, both physical and spiritual, and articulating them within discrete narratives requires the multiple ways in which social suffering is enunciated and has been historically enunciated, and the many ways in which it has helped enunciate us. Learning to grieve for one another and others, as I argued in Grieving, text from Wounded Country, is perhaps the first step to removing ourselves from the ranks of the armies of the indifferent, whose most extreme form is indolence. We know little, however, of the secret relationships, perhaps perverse, perhaps beneficial, that are woven between pain and bilingual speakers. The question, in which language can I speak the truth, would be immediately followed by, in which language can I grieve without killing myself? I finished revising the Spanish version of Liliana's Invincible Summer in early 2020, maybe in March. Back then, I still believed that the book would be able to contribute to catching my sister's alleged femicider. So we brought forward the publication in Mexico, where the book was out in May, coming out in Spain soon afterward. Time and the rampant reality of impunity have taught us that bringing an alleged murder to justice requires more than a book, even an award-winning one. The English version, which had been half cluttered between the Spanish file and half collected in a separate file, required arduous and meticulous work. Penelope unraveled and wove her cloak day and night, all at once. It is a common belief that speakers express themselves best, most accurately, and with greater flexibility in the language in which they utter their first words and structure their first thoughts, the so-called mother tongue. Similarly, many assert, frequently without evidence, that the language that arrived later, the so-called second language or the other language or the fourth language, ties up their imagination and curtails their creativity. In The Restless Dead, I have argued that intimacy with a language isn't always achieved through the mastery of it. To fully inhabit a language, I conversely argued we don't require dominion, but rather its opposite, vulnerability. It is when we hesitate, doubt ourselves, or don't know for sure if something can be uttered or expressed that we can finally and fully be at home in language. Often, the hypervigilance that underlies the expression in another language leads us to inhabit it nervously, hesitantly, in syncopated rhythms. But for that reason, in a whole, unhinderedly, densely manner. The speaker of a foreign tongue often recognizes with paranoid certainty, perhaps with resentment, even hatred, the weaknesses and the restraint of this strange language, its Achilles heel and its porosity, its confines and its tortuous, unrequited ways of building bridges to the world. I still believe Canadian poet Anne Michaels, when in her novel Fugitive Pieces, suggests that it is easier to recount painful events in a language in which they did not occur. This might be the only way, she added in an ominous note, as if in that strangely new and memoryless language, the body could finally find a place, a refuge, rather, where to put words to an experience that is, in its origins, unspeakable, I insist, inexpressible. As if the body were finally capable of approaching a devastating event, but only on the condition of using the mediation of another language. As if one could finally embrace, but only through the interposition of a veil. In one of the essays in Flights, translated into English by Jennifer Croft, Polish author Olga Tokarczuk laments for those who often exclusively live in English, that lingua franca of our time, that makes them, and here I'm quoting her, accessible to everyone and everything all the time. The problem is in monolingualism per se, but that it occurs in the language that dominates commerce, television, pop music, and even the everyday world of instructions and menus at restaurants, in the most diverse instances. Unlike migrants and bilinguals or multilinguals, who always have, as if it were their private rooms, another language they can return to in moments of danger or nostalgia, speakers of the hegemonic language live exposed to the world in a perpetual denotative state. Everyone can understand them, always, says Olga, in utter distress. Their situation is so horrifying that, and here I'm quoting, there are plans to give them some little language of their own. One of those dead ones no one is using anyway, just so that for once they can have something just for themselves. But the situation Olga describes so well, and not without humor, doesn't only occur in English. The condition of linguistic accessibility to which the 2018 Nobel Prize winner refers can take place in any situation where the speaker lives exclusively in the language protected by the state and the military. Spanish, for example, in the Spanish-speaking world. May it be possible that crossing the rigid geopolitical borders of our time could turn hegemonic languages into vulnerable ones, so that their speakers could carve out the spaces, here I'm quoting again, to fall back on or turn to in moments of doubt. Could all of us for once rejoice in the inaccessibility and even secrecy granted by a second or a third or a fifth language? My answer, this is not only possible, it is necessary. May English, the colonialist lingua franca, the language that has just been named the official language of the United States, the language that exposes its monolingual speakers to everyone and everything, be too, one day, a language of refuge? The cases of bilingual or multilingual writers who have published books in more than one language feature prominently in the history of world literature. Less mentioned is the fact that many of these writers often received their elementary education in the language in which they wrote memorable books. Nabokov, of course, who grew up in a trilingual home and became familiar with English at an early age, is just one example. Beckett is another. Like Bifo, the Italian activist, Beckett moved away from the French, in which he learned to name things in the world so that English could shape a more economical and succinct way of expressing himself. My case is different. The relationship between English and Spanish on the US-Mexico border is fraught with historical inequality and exploitation. Settler colonialism has shaped the territory and its languages since at least 1848, the year in which the Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty gave possession of more than half of the Mexican territory to the United States. The English I heard on television and permeated international commerce, and even the humble word of instructions and menus has never been neutral or innocent. I dealt with it and craved it at times, but only with suspicion and hesitation, even resentment. It was, after all, the language of the powerful who allowed or denied passage to the other side. Border officials who practiced daily forms of sadism or humiliation for the sake of it. It was a language both desired and feared. Perhaps that's why it took me so long to come out of the Spanish closet, the closet of Spanish, and sign a book in English. Perhaps that's why I still speak English with an accent, indicating I too have a secret room I could fall back on or turn to in moments of doubt or fright or grief. It will take a whole new lecture to explore how the vibrant literary traditions of experimental literature in the United States have helped me to come to terms with the coloniality inherent to English and the resistance many Englishes practice in this world offer. Suffice it to say that working closely with English so that English could look at itself in the critical mirror of Spanish is a task that I take to heart. I began this lecture in the near empty room of a coastal town, basking on the glorious light of the morning. Allow me to go back to that place now as I conclude this journey. It is late, the orange sunset has gone by, and shadows ascend, covering the sky. I walk briskly through a narrow path with laboring breath until I reach a summit or a place resembling a summit. Here it is, the Pacific Ocean, immense and dark blue, almost black. What is human pain, I ask, compared to these waves that wash ashore again and again, incessantly, since the origins of time and from the confines of the earth, in a language all of themselves. Thank you so much.